your team is spending less time and less money to grow recency than they are to acquire for the very first time.
Audience experience is really important, and that includes your sales experience, your on-site experience, your post-show experience.
And just do some simple math and track it every year. Like, just that step would provide real insight.
Welcome back to Leading the Way, a series designed for arts and cultural leaders, helping you focus on the strategies and actions that turn relationships into revenue. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and visit the link in the description for more insights. This episode, we're talking all things recency, why it matters, and the steps you need to take to impact revenue and relationships. So we're going to talk about recency today. I want to start straight away. It's not a word that we use very often or a word that we hear very often from clients. So why do we need to care about recency? Why is it so critical that this is a key word?
If our field, our sector's leaders were to peer open, like lift the lid on their databases, they would find that most of the people there don't have any future engagement booking activity. Most people in there are doing nothing with the organizations that we're in relationship with.
And I'd be willing to bet most of them haven't done anything in 3 years or more.
Yeah.
So what you have there is a massive resource full of untapped potential, and recency is the way in which we can start to quantify and strategize around how to tap into that potential.
And that ties to revenue, right? And recurring revenue. So there's the end game.
I was going to ask, because we're selling seats all the time, there are some performances that are full. So why do I need to care about recency? Why does it matter? Okay, so people don't have a booking for the next 3 years, or we don't see them very often, we don't see them very recently. But if I'm selling seats, why do I need to care about it?
Well,
I think this is about understanding your audience in a way that allows you to measure and quantify their relationship that you have. My seats may be full, but my seats may be full of people who are there for the very first time. So while there is some recency to be there for the very first time, how closely are we thinking about the next time? Or if there are people there who are back for the first time in 3 years, you've reactivated someone. That relationship is at a different stage, and their next step may be something different than someone who's there for the very first time. So I think looking a little deeper in how we understand the relationships that we have of the folks sitting in the seats is really what's at the core of recency.
over prospecting, under retaining. We used to say that back in the day. And my observation in just talking to leaders is that we are obsessed about the acquisition. We're obsessed about the percentage of capacity sold, and we're not mining the data in the ways that you're describing.
And we have these expectations. We have databases, we have patrons. They know us, they love us, they're going to come. And we send our emails to them, and we just expect that that's doing the job. But we have relationships with these people that we want to build, and we want to bring them back over time. And each of those patrons, each of those segments of our database might have a different reason to come back. We might think about having a different invitation to them. And so the way that we position that and how we reach out to them drives recency in a different way for different people. Mm-hmm. So by looking at that and thinking about that, we can build better response rates and better recency across our database.
You asked the question, I think, like, why do people, what's the end game around recency, or why would people care about, why do people care about it? And I think it's a provocative question, because right now the field is obsessed about revenue anywhere, anyway, right? So that's about selling out houses, generating the income, often spray and pray. And again, if we lift the lid on the database and look in there, there are relationships to mine, different messages to send with different ROI. And by paying attention to those different relationships, the revenue streams don't have to be just short term.
That's the trick, because I think leaders need to strong leaders will need to be able to start thinking about the longer term.
Yeah.
And being able to balance the short-term revenue needs with the long-term sustainable revenue goals. And for many, that could mean it is just as important to worry about who is in the audience as how many are in the audience. And when we can get to that point, when we can balance those and be able to say success can be measured by both, and our revenue goals can be measured by both, not just how many bums in seats, but who. What's the status of their recency? What is the story of their relationship with our organization? Because that's going to tell us where that longer term, reliable, repeatable, sustainable revenue is going to come from. Yes, we care about how many, of course, but that's the simplest metric we can possibly wrap our heads around. The next layer down that will really give you insight as to where future revenue could come from is by looking at the who in addition to the how many.
Well, let's talk about that future revenue then, because if we know and understand that, and recency is a metric that we monitor in the ways that you've described, if we can affect that metric, what impact does that have on future revenue? We care about it, so why? We see evidence that caring about it can have a significant impact on future revenue. Help me understand why.
Well, I think it's because Jill touched on this earlier, a bit about relationships and audiences. There's going to be different levels of ROI, right? We're investing money to bring in audience members. We're investing our team's time to sell tickets and to drive subscribers and to generate donors. We're having to be really, hopefully, being really thoughtful and careful about where we're spending time and where we're spending money. But by understanding that there's a vastly different ROI from a brand new first-time attender versus someone who is attending regularly and frequently over the next few months, your team is spending less time and less money to grow recency than they are to acquire for the very first time. So that revenue that's being generated by more recent or by reactivated folks who are already in your database, that revenue is coming at a higher ROI. And the other thing I'll add to that is that I think it's important to understand that recency is the gateway to frequency. You don't get frequency without recency. And the reason we care about frequency is because frequency is what drives loyalty, which is what turns ticket buyers into subscribers and subscribers into donors. But without recency, we can't get to frequency. And so thinking about that as the precursor, as the early metric that we would want leaders to be focused on is important to driving those future revenue streams.
Christina, yesterday you and I were talking about this word recency. It's a weird word. I mean, if you think about it, like what does it really mean, recency? And we ended up using the word engagement or activity, right? Mm-hmm. So if someone is, recency reflects calendar. It reflects how recent our date was, but it can be applied across lots of different stories of lots of different people in our databases. I think about storytelling here. If I'm a leader, we talk in this jargon around segmentation, and we use words like recency and frequency. But really what a leader could do with a team is tell stories about the types of people in a database and stories about their engagement that reflect some of this data, I think.
Yeah, I think it's about thinking about our patrons as people, as human beings with whom we are in a relationship.
Yes.
And thinking about in your personal relationships, what it feels like if you go out with somebody and then you don't hear from them for a while, or you don't make plans for a future time out and time together.
Right.
And you feel like your relationship's drifting apart and you prioritize that relationship less and less. And so our opportunity in thinking about the patron as people and thinking about how we want to bring them back and have another experience with them is really, really key, because our patrons feel that from us.
Yeah.
It's quite a relationship to sustain when people, on average, don't actually attend our venues very often at all.
Like, and I think, 3 years, to Barrett's point.
Right,
like
and
most of it.
And it's a data point that often when we put in front of people, we talk about core audience, we talk about people that will even come to the box office or on the phone and say, I visit all the time.
Right.
Whereas actually, when you look into it, it's not really very often at all. And to your point, if we were having an in-person relationship, we saw each other every 18 months, what sort of relationship would that be? So we can have, but just by changing the dial on recency, what you're saying is we can have a pretty significant impact on that relationship and thus the potential future value from a monetary point of view from that relationship.
The renewability, the retention and reactivation of that relationship.
If this is so critical to revenue at a time when budgets are so tight, why is this not a leadership priority? It sounds to me as though that could have a very significant impact on revenue.
Well, you think about the environment we're in right now and the pressures that leaders face. I mean, you put yourself in the seat of the leaders that we engage with, and they have cash pressures, and they have board pressures, and they have staff churn, and they have political pressures. There's lots of pressure. So under that pressure, it's easy to just simplify it to, I need revenue this year, right now. And to your point made earlier, to think about the short term and say, I'll get to the long term. But we know in our own finances, we know in our own relationships, we know in anything that wants to be sustainable, we have to balance the short term with the long term. We have to do both and. But I think that's why the pressures right now are real. And the leaders who will have an impact, whose organizations will thrive through, will find a way to do both and, I think.
That's right. I do want to make sure we're being clear that recency is not a long-term play. It has long-term benefit. But if I've got a leader who's saying, I need revenue right now, the very next question from me is going to be, great. From who? And let's talk about where and who is that revenue. I hear you, your business needs it. Let's talk about from who, so that we can optimize where our teams are spending time and money. You have the opportunity to engage recency in the near term, as well as building towards a longer term, higher value relationship. You know, what we saw coming out of COVID was, for many organizations, we saw big increases in acquisition audiences on the back end. As behavior changed and as we were moving through recovery, in both the UK and in North America, we saw higher proportions of audiences coming in new for the first time. The number of folks who we were reactivating, who had maybe gone dormant through the pandemic, was starting to settle back to pre-pandemic levels. So we're in a moment now where we have had, over the past few years, a higher proportion of relatively new but infrequent relationships that we need to manage. So where that revenue comes right now for many organizations is probably sitting right there in their database from people who we've only been on a first date with. So it is this yes and, right, of trying to make sure that we're saying, we can drive revenues now if we know where to focus in the right place, and that can include reaching into our database to find them.
Yeah, for sure.
You've talked about COVID and new audiences post-COVID. I think what I've seen, and I wonder if you've seen this too, is how long the ripple effect of that has impacted the behavior in our databases. You talked about new audiences immediately after COVID. This last season, I have seen clients with the highest re-engagement rate of people that have not visited since COVID still coming through the system. What impact is that having on recency? We still talk about, should we still be talking about the impact of COVID? And does that change some of our decision making as we look and think about recency?
You have recently brought this to our conversation. And I think it's really interesting. And you're looking at the data in our benchmark deeply. But there's, I think, weariness within the sector and a little bit of PTSD from the pandemic. We're tired of comparing to the pandemic. But if we don't acknowledge what happened in databases during that time and what the shift in behavior and engagement did to pipeline for recency and frequency, it's a mistake. And this notion that we should be looking at these segments that you're talking about and measuring them and acknowledging the period that we're at right now, which might actually be a period of pipeline development, of optimism, of growth. I
think it is.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
We nerd out on the math for a second.
Yeah.
So we are barely 3 seasons out from when most organizations were kind of back to their normal rhythms and operations of a season. We are barely 3 seasons out. Now let's think about how long it takes, all the data we've been talking about, how long it takes to go from that first visit to the second visit. We're lucky if it happens in 12 months. More often, if it's going to happen at all, it's going to happen within 18 months. Great. So there's half of that time cycle to just maybe get the second visit for a disproportionately large number of our audiences on this side of the pandemic. And now from there, how easy it is to get them to attend at the levels of frequency required to move them into subscription or membership or being a donor, right? We are just at the moment where our pipelines should be refilling. And if they aren't, if you aren't seeing the returns of that pipeline refilling, there should still be a pretty massive opportunity within your database to say, right, we've come back. We probably have less mature relationships in our database than we had certainly before the pandemic, which are going to require more work and more attention in order to get them to those high value levels of loyalty and donation, membership and subscription. But the timing of this, we just start looking at the number of months. There is a good news story, and we're just barely getting to the point to where there should be enough volume to start to see those numbers.
And in that first season back, we decided that yet again that subscription was no longer relevant because we lost people through COVID. We did. And some people's subscriber bases were decimated from that. And it did have an impact on the UK as well, because even though there is not a huge amount of subscription, the recency and frequency of single ticket buyers was really impacted. But subscription pipeline, membership pipeline here in the UK, I think it's growing. And those tactics for frequency absolutely still have a place, but it does still require the things that we're talking about in terms of clear invitation at the right time.
Relationship management.
And it takes time. It's that dating analogy that we've talked about for years. It's you don't ask somebody to marry you after the first date. And so it takes time to build trust, to build experience. Audience experience is really important. And that includes your sales experience, your on-site experience, your post-show experience. How are we building and communicating those relations with those people and building those relationships?
I love this good news story because if you marry up what we're describing is happening in databases, what we're inviting leaders to prioritize, which is relationship management, and then you look at economic growth that's projected for 26 in the UK and Canada and the US, and it is projected. Might we actually go into this coming calendar cycle with a sense of abundance, like a little bit of a sense of abundance, pipeline, confidence, rather than what we've been suffering from over the past 3 years? It's an interesting shift in the narrative that I'd love to advance
and
right now.
And important because when we act with fear, we make poor decisions, and we do things like papering the house and comping tickets and things that don't serve us and frankly don't serve our patrons who are loyal to us and who should be getting the best value. So thinking from a place of abundance and confidence and knowing that we're building a foundation over time.
Yes, studying data, clear-eyed confidence. There's a lot of disruption right now, but it was a little bit of a surprise to me actually to see the data and the projections for 26. So if we marry it up, clear-eyed, data-driven, courage and confidence, what might that do?
You talked about different types of audiences, new, dormant. Are there stages of dormancy that we see in databases that are critical cut-off moments for a relationship to be lost to us? How recent do people need to be? If someone's coming once a year to the Nutcracker or Panto, is that enough?
So for many, coming once a year is well above average,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
That is well above average. So if you find that consistency and that recency from audience members tied to a very particular product,
Celebrate it.
great.
Yeah.
Hang on to it, celebrate it. Think about maybe other ways to elevate that relationship beyond just maybe that ticket buying experience. But what we tend to see is that we have about 18 months to get folks back before the likelihood of their return falls off a pretty steep cliff. And when they're brand new, that number tends to be about 12 to 14 months before that really plateaus. So when they're brand new, we've got that really fresh recency. So yes, they've been within the past year. They don't have a long history with us. What we see is their likelihood to return really plateaus and then drops at about 12 months.
Yeah.
Can we really affect that though, or is that not program?
Well, nothing's more important than program, right? So program is fundamental, right? As understanding the product. If you're going to, if you're going to put a product on your stages that is not intended to engage people over time, if it's a one-off, it's a special kind of project, then you may find it really difficult, no matter how good the rest of your program is. If you brought people in through one particular piece of product that you don't really have an intention to repeat over time, you're going to find it really difficult to get them into something else. So I mean, the importance of product can't be overstated, but we can impact recency. And I think this is where campaign tactics and messaging and segmentation and where your team is investing. Each hour that your team has is basically the same cost to you, right? Your hard costs to market to brand new audiences, that's really different than to existing audiences. And there you are talking about really different levels of financial investment. But your team's time comes at basically a fixed cost to your organization. And so you're having to make really strategic decisions on how to best utilize the next hour of my marketing and communications team's time. And we may find that next hour can get a higher yield by focusing on reactivating audiences or keeping those new audiences engaged with us than an hour spent fishing with probably not enough money to drive in new audiences.
You know, this is why you referenced the dating analogy, but can we really affect it? Well, yes, of course we can. If we think about our patrons as people that we're in a relationship with. So you're talking about the ROI on time, and yet the ability to think about those people as relationships that we want to re-engage, people that we want to continue to talk with. I find that can resonate with teams just as well as how are we ROIing a specific investment of.
And there are two sides of the ROI coin. So there's the expense side, but there's also the revenue side.
Yeah.
And we often have said all patrons are not created equal. And so a single ticket buyer brings a certain amount of revenue to the organization. A multi-buyer brings more revenue to the organization, and a subscriber, a donor bring in even more. So you have to look at both sides of those things and think about your investment of time and your investment of marketing dollars to reactivate those patrons that have the higher revenue opportunities.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting that so first-time single ticket buyers tend to spend the most on their tickets. They have the highest, per cap, the average ticket price that they're paying on for their tickets. Our most recent and frequent ticket buyers tend to have the lowest. And oftentimes we'll hear from organizations saying, why should I be focusing there?
Yeah.
They're paying less for their tickets.
Yeah.
And so to your point, what we've got to do is that shifting our focus and our point of view to say, right, they're paying less for their tickets for that particular event. But the value of that entire relationship, because they're attending more frequently, because they're, also maybe a donor or a subscriber, the value of that relationship can still be 4x, 5x what the value of that one-time single ticket buyer is when we're not just comparing what they're paying from an average ticket price.
And we're not just looking annually.
Right.
So if we look at the renewability and the lifetime value, which is another.
And even annually, right? So even someone who's buying my mid-price ticket but is attending 3 times is going to be way more valuable than that single ticket buyer who's buying the premium seat but only attending once.
Sure.
So there's a value metric question there, I think, that we are not looking at.
And the question is, can we affect it? And programming, of course it makes a difference, of course it does, but what I would want us to reinforce, people to understand, is that the way we can affect it is by inviting them, by engaging and asking them to come back, asking them to take advantage of their benefits, asking them to upgrade, inviting. That we can affect these metrics.
And timing is important when we are asking people. I mean, certainly for first timers, getting to them right away and reminding them of the experience that we just had together and thanking them for that and inviting them back very purposely can have an immediate impact and an important impact, because it's such a big part of our ticket base, for any show. And so getting those people to come back more recently is really critical. The other segments, you might get a lower response rate on an email that you send to lapsed buyers, for example. But over time, with purpose, with intention, with discipline, with repeat focus, you can chip away at that number. And you are not only building revenue and recurring revenue, you're building your pipeline for subscribers. You're building your pipeline for donors, and that's really important.
You talk about time. This takes time in teams that are stretched and time is scarce. You're a great proponent of stop doing. Are there things that we need to stop in pursuit of a focus on recency? Like, how would the culture or the leadership of those teams change if the culture around recency was the leading point?
Yeah, I think, as you said, I am a proponent, because as any leaders, any part of our organization, everybody's stretched. There's so much to do. There's so much to accomplish. We feel those pressures of needing to have the full house, of the board members, of the, of
the artistic director saying, why isn't it well sold?
So being able to be careful with our time and really focus it where it will have impact is really important. And sometimes it's hard for leaders to know where those places are. So it's helpful to look to data. It's helpful to learn what has worked in other places, and to give ourselves permission to say, I'm going to stop doing this. I'm going to stop chasing these vanity metrics. I'm going to stop doing things like, and I hate to say this because people will take this personally, but not a press release for everything. Social media investment, the things that we feel we have to do because
and that feel good, likes feel good, followers feel good.
Right. And it's a thing that just sort of we feel like we should do. We have to do. We always do this. But is that really having impact? And I think where we can focus our time on things that are measurable and things that are personal, that build those personal relationships, that's where you're going to get
these are difficult decisions, right? I mean, they are difficult decisions, especially in the era that we are. Because the era that we're in now is one where these kinds of tactics, especially with the advent of social media, there's real pressure, political and otherwise, to be active there. And we started this conversation around following data. The challenge was, do leaders know even some of these basic answers to some of these basic questions, like what portion of my database has a future activity or booking? And if we were to stop doing things that we couldn't back up in data, in results-based data, what would that change in the results themselves? Stop doing is the hardest thing to do for our own organization. It's the hardest thing to do.
It is.
But it's one of the most important things to do right now.
I'd say here's a hot take.
I knew it was coming. I could see it.
There had to be a hot take brewing, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this notion of vanity metrics and stop doing, my hot take is capacity sold is a vanity a vanity metric.
Yeah, totally.
That is a metric that only is about how we feel about how full a house is, and so therefore we equate that often with quality or value of and so I don't find that often to be an actionable metric. And oftentimes it is applied uniformly across programming. That there are dictates that say every show must get to 70% capacity. Well, not every show is going to have the same level of demand. It's not meant to reach the same audience. It's not serving the same audience in the same ways. And so when we put those kinds of overarching, oversimplified metrics in front of teams, we're putting them in a really difficult spot where they tend to overinvest time and energy trying to get a product that just doesn't have the demand to get to 70%. The opportunity cost of that time is massive because it could be spent on getting the show that's getting to 70 up to 80, or focused on a retention effort, or focused on a frequency effort. That's where I get this finite amount of time that we have with our teams. The opportunity costs of where we're steering them can be pretty massive. And so by overemphasizing, I'd say stop doing the overemphasis on capacity sold. If we want to think about that more in a more actionable, strategic way for our teams, at least break it down. At least start to understand on a given night, not just what the total capacity sold, but how many of the audience were new, how many were active, they had been around in the past 18 months, as well as the event I'm just looking at, and how many people have I reactivated in that audience. That can start to tell me what's happening in my relationships and help my and help steer my team in a strategic direction.
And it's really interesting from a programming perspective. If you start to look at things that way, you can start to understand that different programming can be, success can be measured in different ways. Right? We talk about honey and magnets. And there is programming that is really critical to our mission, that is art for art's sake, and that is sticky, and that people want to, certain people are attracted to and will come back to. And those are often those patrons that are more loyal, that come more frequently, that have a greater lifetime value with us. And so there's a different measure of success there than it's a full house. And so it's important to remember that, I think.
What I love about this is that there's three things that I hear regularly. I think we hear regularly as definitions of success that we're challenging. Top line revenue, percentage of capacity sold. Those two, understanding the who, not just the volume. And likes and followers and these vanity metrics, the things that make us feel rather than the things that we can measure.
But the thing is about those metrics is they're often making these teams feel as though they're not doing a good job.
Yes.
Right? You know, if a show isn't sold to, and my heart goes out, and those shows that are so critical for the other honey, that keep people recent, that keep people frequent, that have often our most highest value patrons, are seen as a complete failure because they didn't reach the capacity sold metric. And I think actually, although, you know, vanity metrics should make people feel good, actually more often than not, they're making people feel pretty dreadful. That they're not doing a good enough job. Imagine if we did celebrate that, okay, we got to 40% capacity sold, but look at the new audiences. The new and different audiences that came in. Or, wonderful, all of our members were here. And our members, we know, are really valuable because they're super frequent, and this programming was critical for that. Well, I think with stretched teams, things would feel so much better if we celebrated these things.
Definition of success. Right?
Which means pulling programming into the recency conversation from the very beginning. If we are not thinking about the role that our programming is playing to influence these recency metrics, then we're missing the trick. We need to be thinking about these job descriptions and these expectations of success that are going to come with programming to be thinking about recency. Program is the number one thing
of programming.
That's right.
Who needs to own this? Who needs to own recency as an obsession?
Oh, I think the leader needs to own recency. The leader needs to set the tone, that understanding the who. I love that. I love that phrase. Understanding the who, not just the volume, not the tension between those things. The leader needs to own to create a culture of attention to the things we're talking about.
Yeah, 100%. And it's not just in the ticket buying metrics, it's in the subscription, the membership, the donation metrics as well, that we need to own the recency of our relationships. It's an indicator of the health of a relationship. And so a leader needs to care about the health of the relationships that its organization has with its audiences.
So what is the one health metric that anyone listening to this now should go and immediately look at in their database? They should lift the hood up and what are they looking for?
Well, we started by saying what percentage of your database, what percentage of those households have any future engagement or booking. And I think that's where I'd start.
Yep.
It's simple.
Yeah.
It's an easy data point to get to. And if you look at it over time, it can
and
show you the way.
And no one knows it today.
I doubt they do. And I think if you wanted to go maybe one step further would be to start just looking at these 3 simple categories across your major programs. Instead of just counting, oh, we were at 60% sold last night, maybe asking to see within the house, how many of them were new, how many of them were active recently, and how many of them were reactivated for the first time. If we can start to put just simple definitions around understanding the who in a bit more clarity, I think that'd be a pretty big step forward.
Yeah.
So if my teams were focused here, what should I be looking for in the data or the revenue to understand its impact?
If you were to say, if my audience was 10% more recent, with more recency is going to come more frequency. So if I took the same level of frequency in my currently active audience members, and if I could just grow that number by 10%, because the household value of those relationships is so much higher than the other relationships you have between lapsed audiences and new audiences, the revenue multiplier there is quite significant. So small adjustments within the right segments of the database can have disproportionate revenue impacts and can come at a lower cost of sale at the same time. So that's why it's important to know where to focus and to not just think about your audiences as one homogenous group of people who like our organization, but rather looking at them as different flavors of relationships or different stages of relationships.
And you've introduced something that we haven't talked about yet, which is the net impact, right? So when we look at the acquisition of new audiences, it's revenue. It's one-time revenue, mostly, at a very high cost. So you net that out and you can see a net contribution. But when you look at this frequent audience and you look at the repeating, even in one season, the repeating revenue and the cost there, which is lower, and you net that out, there's a real difference in that impact.
And their likelihood to come back again increases really significantly. Just that hurdle of one more attendance.
Which is a recency number, right? Because essentially, if I'm going from a recency of 12, let's put the numbers into months, right? If my recency is 12 and I'm coming once a year, if I can turn that recency into 9, you're getting me there every 9 months, or if I can get that to 6, right? And you're getting me now twice within a 12-month cycle. And that is where you would start to see. So that is how we can quantify recency as a way to, yes, get around to frequency, but the value of that relationship becomes much higher, and to your point, at a much lower cost.
It's a real challenge though when we look at individual show contributions to revenue, because actually what gets missed then is the impact that somebody moving from 12 to 6 months has on your overall revenue. It's like, okay, that show hit goal, moving on to the next one, but actually it can have a really significant impact on revenue growth over multiple seasons when that becomes it. But looking at it on a micro level, they feel like small amounts of numbers. From that show, 5 first timers came back for a second visit. $500 okay, but actually they're going to come back again. Their likelihood of coming back again, the compounding nature of that can be really significant.
It feels hard. I'm struggling with, and I want to make it simple, because we're organized to think about event by event revenues and budgets, campaigns, membership and subscription and donor. We're organized to think in those ways. And then when we start to talk about frequency and recency, it starts to feel hard to measure and track, but it's not. I mean, one could ask staff members to, on a seasonal basis, to just track these 3 segments and ask the question, what proportion of my audiences were new and active and lapsed? You could ask that question. And you could ask the question, what were the expenses? Ballpark it. Like, what were the expenses thrown at those segments? And just do some simple math and track it every year. Like, just that step would provide real insight.
Yeah, I think there's, not that this is going to make it any more simple, but I would challenge leaders to think about the ROI of the time and money spent in marketing is only being measured in a 12-month cycle.
Right.
We tend to question this notion of, well, how much money or time should I be spending on this activity that you say TRG is going to help me with my database when the response rates I've seen from this segment being really small.
Right.
And, this is where needing to have the hot air balloon that allows you to rise up and to see the horizon out in front of you and say, what's the expression, pennies make pounds or something, right? Like this notion of these small response rates, these incremental things, these investments I'm making now, I'm not measuring the ROI of that by the end of this season. I'm measuring the ROI of that as a part of next year and the year after to see what proportion of my audiences are staying recent. And just what proportion of my audiences are coming more than once, right? Frequency is a really important element to recency. And if most organizations have 70 to 80% of their audiences coming only once a year, and while, as we said, for some, that can be fine, right, on the nature of that relationship. But a really simple KPI to start holding our teams accountable to would be, what percentage of our audiences are coming more than once a season? Full stop. And what can we do to make that number just a little bit bigger? Just a little 5% bigger makes a massive revenue difference. You're right.
You all have heard this story, and you've heard it because it's so compelling. Major dance company in the United States who made the decision, taking what felt like a very big risk, to invite first-time Nutcracker attendees to come back, using the dating analogy. Let's invite you back immediately. Through email, this was 15 years ago, through email and the telephone and a piece of direct mail. It felt expensive. Nutcracker feels like, why would I start there? But if I could move the needle from 1% of those Nutcracker buyers to 3% coming back, or even 2. So they started that work. And over every single program, over 10 years, they did that invitation back. And over that 10-year period, their subscriber volume and average commitment grew. It wasn't they grew subscriber volume by selling smaller packages. It was stable and growing commitment of those subscribers over a 10-year period. And I visited them 10 years later, and they had stopped that for 2 or 3 years. It must have been 12 or 13 years later I visited. And you could see over the decade what happened in that subscriber growth. And then once it stopped, how that subscriber retention rate just fell apart. So that's for me, it's a long story to tell an arc and a narrative about the power of this incremental impact when you stick to it.
And when you understand the net revenue of those relationships, it wakes you up to how critical it is to invest time in that relationship. You talked about phone calls. It's really interesting because, why are we so afraid of picking up the phone?
Yeah, right.
I have a client here in the UK that their box office team, and you do too, I think, that are phoning members when they've not renewed. And they're like, wow.
Right.
Because the number one reason for members not renewing is nobody asked me to.
Right.
I mean, we did, they just didn't see.
Right.
But, an email gets lost. And when some companies are emailing us every day, and we're afraid to do it more than once a week, that phone call, they want to hear from us.
It's old school, like direct mail is old school. and it's a personal reach out, and it's just
works.
Yeah, it works. That's right.
Now that you've heard this episode's takeaway, think about one action you can take this week to impact recency and drive stronger relationships. For more insights and resources, please visit the link in the description below. And thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Leading the Way.